Jesus was not a fun guy to hang out with. Now, I say that because, quite bluntly, if you look through the Bible, they never once mention, do you ever see anything where it says, Jesus smiled, Jesus laughed, Jesus told a joke? Nothing. It's always just extremely straightforward. We're told Jesus' words, but rarely do you ever see any emotion described in the Bible. In John, when Jesus turns over the tables of the money changers in the temple and drives everyone out, it says his words, but it doesn't say he was angry. We assume that a lot of times, but it just says this is what Jesus said. You start to get this idea after a while, you read these things, and maybe Jesus was so much in control that he didn't show any emotion. When he calls out the scribes and the Pharisees, he calls them vipers and snakes. But again, we don't see that he's ever showing any emotion. Think of all the people that Jesus healed, some of them who had been in agony for years. And we're not even then, are we rarely told what Jesus feels at the moment. But there are rare instances in the Bible when we get a glimpse into Jesus' heart. And when we do, we should pay special attention. Now, part of it has to do with the style of writing in those days of the Gospels. They didn't write in Jesus was angrily said. Those are things that are a little more modern. But in this scripture lesson, along with a select few, you do get an idea of exactly what maybe Jesus was feeling. Look at this lesson again. I'll give you the Spark Notes version instead of the long, drawn-out one. What you don't understand is before this went on, Jesus and the disciples had been in Jerusalem, and they had barely gotten out without being arrested or stoned, and they were basically on the run. And so they'd gone back over across the Jordan to the place where John had baptized Jesus. That's where they get word that one of Jesus' dearest friends, Lazarus, is deathly ill. Now, Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha live in Bethany, which was back in Judea, which is why these disciples are a little hesitant about going back. But it's only a couple miles from Jerusalem. But instead of going to Lazarus and healing him, Jesus waits for a few days, and Lazarus dies. Only then does Jesus decide to go back to Bethany. Now, if he was going to heal him, couldn't he have just gone ahead and gone in the first place? The disciples are nervous about returning to Jerusalem, but he tells them he's going to wake up Lazarus, do something miraculous so people will believe. So off they go, and Martha comes to meet him and expresses her faith that Lazarus would have survived if Jesus had been there. Mary comes to Jesus along with many friends and family, and all of them are crying. And right here is where I want to stop. I've shared with you this before, and that is the purpose of preaching is not education or anything else as much as it is to share what we call good news. The gospel, the great news of Jesus Christ and what Jesus means in our lives. And there is some fantastic news that shows up here. But again, the beginning of this chapter is not exactly comforting. Lazarus, along with his sisters, is described as being loved by Jesus. And so how does Jesus show that wonderful love that he has for Lazarus and the sisters? He stays put and instead says, it's for the glory of God so that God's Son can be glorified through it. He doesn't rush to Bethany and heal Lazarus. Instead, he lets Mary and Martha live in fear for 2 days, watching their brother slowly die, and we have no idea how painful that death may have been. But it's then that Jesus decides that now is the time to go to Bethany after Lazarus has died, and by the time he arrives, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. 4 days when Mary and Martha had to mourn the loss of their brother without their much-loved friend Jesus. And when Mary comes to meet Jesus, Martha that is first, she greets him with what I consider a gentle rebuke. If you'd been there, I know he wouldn't have died. And Jesus assures her that Lazarus will rise again, which Martha assumes means the day of resurrection. And in this time of great grief, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though they die. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? And at this point, I realized Jesus would have made a lousy chaplain. Consider this. They are mourning deeply for the loss of a loved one. And Jesus asks a theological question. Now, you and I know that Jesus is going to raise Lazarus, but Mary and Martha don't know that. And in their grief, this is the kind of things he asked them. But this is when what I consider my favorite and most important part of the story occurs, because you finally see the humanity of Jesus. When Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And when Jesus saw her crying and the Jews who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. He asked, where have you laid him? They replied, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to cry. Jesus was deeply disturbed again when he came to the tomb. Jesus knew what he was about to do. He knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. So why all of a sudden now does he cry and start to feel upset? I think because there was nothing that could erase that moment when Mary and Martha and all those other people were filled with grief and sorrow. And now Jesus understood how they felt. Jesus himself became deeply disturbed and troubled and began to cry. And this is the moment that I see as good news, because I believe this is a time when Jesus changed, when God changed. We often describe God using words, omnipotent, omniscient, meaning all-knowing. But there's a big difference between knowing something and experiencing something, a huge difference. As Christians, we believe that in Jesus, God took on human form, that Jesus was both fully human and fully divine. And trust me, there are still many times when I have a hard time exactly wrapping my head around how that works. But in this story, I see Jesus' humanity more clearly than any other time. And I believe that God then not only knew pain and suffering that we experience, but understood our pain and suffering because he experienced our grief firsthand. Again, think about the difference between knowledge and experience. You can hand someone a relatively intelligent person and give them an auto repair manual, and they can read it over and over again, memorize all the pictures and illustrations, and then you could say, okay, fix the car. And they'd have a hard time. It takes someone that's actually had a little hands-on experience and work to be able to do those kinds of things. Medical students read books, go to classes, learn important facts, and memorize procedures, but until they actually work with patients over and over again, do they begin to understand what medicine is really about. For all you other fanboys out there, I'm going to use a Star Trek analogy. Data. Star Trek, second generation. Think about it. Data, smarter than anybody else on the entire ship and just knows everything there is to possibly know. Data, who's strong, can do anything, but doesn't understand human emotions. I think it's possible to think about God. Our Muslim friends say that God is wholly other, that God is so completely different from human beings that there's no way that God could have become human. But as we say, we believe that Jesus is God incarnate. And I believe it was in Jesus that God now not only knew, but experienced the grief and sorrow that we have. Because let's face it, There's nothing stronger, I don't think there's any stronger emotion than that of grief or sorrow at the loss of a loved one. I mentioned in the earlier service, I don't ever, strangely enough, I can't ever say or think of a time when I worried about death for myself. But as a parent, if you think about the death of your children, I can watch a movie where that happens and I'm in tears. I'm the biggest mush bucket under the sun when that happens, because it doesn't take much for me to put myself in that place and think what it would be like to have my child gone. And I think all of us have known or will know in the very near future that experience of loss and pain and suffering that comes with the death of a loved one. And Jesus saw what it meant to those people. Mary, Martha, all those friends, and how deeply it affected them, and Jesus was disturbed and began to cry. Jesus was God's willingness to understand us completely, to take that special relationship between God and humanity and make it even more special. We were created in God's image, but let's face it, we're not God. There are aspects of how we're supposed to live, I believe, that makes us in God's image, but for God to really know us, it took being part of us in Jesus Christ. And in knowing us fully, I believe God's compassion for us became even greater, and because of that, we have the resurrection. Because in understanding our sorrow and grief at the death of a loved one, God went beyond anything God had done before in the gift of the resurrection, showing us that there really is nothing that will separate us forever. It's a message I often share at funerals, but honestly, it's not one that often comes up in the lectionary that I think about preaching about. But I couldn't help it when I saw this passage about Jesus. Jesus understood our pain and suffering. And God wanted to give us the assurance that our pain and sorrow and separation are not the final word. The resurrection promises us that love is the ultimate victor. Joy is the final result. And so for me, the good news, which I consider great news, was made clear in two little words from this passage. It used to be a trivia question from the King James version of the Bible. They say, what's the shortest verse? Jesus wept.